Hey kiddos, so today we are going to talk about the Progressive Era from 1901 to 1917. For context with the Progressive Era, it's important to remember how Americans have tried to reform society in the past. So we think of the antebellum reformers leading up to the Civil War, which included education and temperance and abolition and women's rights. And much like the Progressive Era of like this period, those reformers, if you remember, as tensions started getting high as we got closer to the Civil War, a lot of those reforms kind of like were put on the back burner as there was a lot of political division. And the abolition movement did kind of play a role in that. Obviously, with the 13th Amendment, slavery is going to be abolished, and the 14th and 15th Amendment during Reconstruction, that's going to give African Americans more rights. And from there on, the economy is kind of struggling. So we talked about, the panics, the speculative bubbles, the industrial revolution is occurring. And so really the focus of American politics was focused in during that Gilded Age on the economy and capitalism and laissez-faire, view of high tariffs and factory jobs. But what we also know that happened during the Gilded Age is that there were a lot of other things going on in society, some negative effects of this growing economic superpower. And a lot of it had to do with, urbanization and cities and working conditions. We talked about the labor movement. The labor movement plays a direct role within the Progressive Era. The progressive reformers would have been nowhere if it weren't for the work that those labor movements did during the Gilded Age. Unfortunately, they weren't very successful because they didn't have the support of the federal government. That's why 1901, there's kind of this major change, because in 1901, Teddy Roosevelt is president, and he actually sympathizes with labor to a certain extent. And so that's the turning point. That's why we consider it 1901. 1907 or 1917 is when we classify it as ending because of America's entry in World War I, much like the Civil War, right? As we're entering war, the focus of America changes drastically. However, there are going to be some federal amendments to the Constitution that are going to finally kind of support. So that's women and temperance. But we'll make that connection too as to why World War I was the proper timing for that, according to the federal government. So like what I just kind of said, the origins of this movement is going to be because of industrialization and the labor movement. The populists also play a really important role in influencing this era of progressive reform. And their goal is to improve life. They're going to build on existing society, and it's pretty moderate if you think about it. Moderate political changes. There were radicals, so we're going to talk about the Socialist Party today that wanted much more drastic change for this in order to improve life. But progressives of this period were actually fairly moderate. It made kind of like common sense approach that collected people, Republicans and Democrats. Most progressive reforms, it really wasn't. It wasn't too much of a partisan issue. There was a lot of bipartisanship. And it's also going to kind of divide especially the Republican Party, between the conservatives and the progressive Republicans. Most progressives, they wanted to limit the power of big business. So those large monopolies, Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, the railroad industries, and then become more democratic. So we're going to talk about civil rights a little bit as well, and then with women, but even like local level, trying to encourage more democracy, and then strengthen social justice. It's going to be kind of like a stepping stone. You're going to see state and local governments implement these things, but that's something that had happened also during the Gilded Age. Like states were giving women the right to vote during these years. again, that was a little bit more radical during the Gilded Age. But they're passing like city ordinances to protect windowless tenements. That was something that New York City like tried to improve. And so those things kind of weren't enough. A lot of progressives at this point believe that the federal government should step in and play a role in that. And that's where Teddy Roosevelt comes in, is he sympathized and he agreed. And he said, we need to make America more equitable for everyone. So some of progressives' concerns. One is the rising power of big business that continues into the 20th century. The uncertainties of the business cycle. So the gold standard is going to play a role in this as well. So during the populist movement, which I know we didn't get to talk about, but in my lecture, I talked about bimetallism and how there was a push for putting more money in the economy so that poor Americans, the have-nots, could have more access to that, because during this time, the gap between the rich and the poor was growing exponentially more and more. We also had those conflicts between labor, so the people working, the workers, and capital, which are kind of your industrialists, your factory owners, your CEOs, your people that are buying and selling stock, your investors, your financiers. And then there was a lot of political corruption. So we've talked about political machines in the past where they have, this is mostly a municipal level and state level, where politicians were taking advantage of their power and intimidating voters in ways in order to make sure that they maintained that power. So like today, like money kind of dominates equals political power. Back then, it really had more about patronage and manpower. And so civil service reform was something that's taking place during that time. And then you have the Jim Crow laws of the South, which we talked about within the New South. Unfortunately, like these with Jim Crow, is that people will draw attention to it. People like W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida Tarbell and Booker T. Washington. Yet we know that Jim Crow laws are going to exist in the South through the 1960s in the United States. That's one of the kind of the failures of progressive reform, is that not enough white Americans united with African American reformers in that regard. And then women's suffrage. And World War I is going to play more of a role in that, in women finding success, but they are going to eventually find success at the federal level, state level, a decent amount, almost half the states, like 20, about 20 states had given women the right to vote, but on a federal level, there were still a lot of states that weren't giving women the right to vote. So who are they? Like what types of people within society are you going to find? A lot of Protestant church leaders. That makes a connection. So if we're looking for in an essay for synthesis, so making a connection to a previous time period, if you think about how the Great Awakening inspired religious or reformers before the Civil War, right? They needed to do good works and they needed to help less fortunate. They needed to convert people. That is similar to before the Civil War. African Americans are going to play a role in it. Union leaders, feminists, a lot of them are urban middle class men and women. A lot of women, because they have the luxury of having enough money to be secure and time on their hands in order to help poor immigrants and urban slums. The working class people, the weak people that are working 10 to 12-hour days, 6 days a week, they don't have the time to devote or organize and devote time to these issues. They'll show up at protests and things like that, which is also impressive. But the organization took a lot more time than they had the ability. They had to feed their children. They had to put food on the table. So one of the Protestants that kind of started this movement of the social gospel by Walter Rauschenbusch, he urged Protestant Americans to take care of the less fortunate. typically native-born, older, elite families who felt like their job was to help them. So they're going to replace wealthy industrialists and urban political machines. Other important leaders, so we know Republicans like Teddy Roosevelt, Robert LaFollette from Wisconsin is going to encourage, like with voting, William Jennings Bryan, former populist Democratic nominee in 1896, and then Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, is also going to support progressive reform. So you see about Republicans and Democrats. Here's a good question to think about synthesis, especially as we've covered more content. Remember that the AP exam is really going to assess your understanding of these time periods and making connections between them. So how are the progressives of this time period like the Jeffersonians? How are they like the Jacksonians, the populists? And one of that is the idea of democratic values. So at the beginning of the year, we talked about continuity and change over time. Democracy or democratic values has played a role since Plymouth or since Jamestown. These ideas of democracy and representative government. And even if you think about Jefferson's view of the common man, and even Jackson kind of expanding upon that with universal white male suffrage, the populists are going to argue that they need a party that represents the people. And so those are things that even if you look at like progressives today, there are people today in Congress that call themselves progressives. What strategies are they using that are similar? What are they not doing? And how is that going to affect their success at getting those reforms? So before the public could actually take action and encourage legislation, they need to know kind of like what's going on. There's no social media back then, right? So you have newspapers and magazines. So journalists and the free press did play an important role in getting progressive reform. And so these journalists informed them about the realities of the political corruption, the working conditions in factories, the living conditions in slums. And the people that exposed this corruption of the Gilded Age were referred to as muckrakers by Teddy Roosevelt, right? So we talked about this a little bit in class where, they're stirring the pot. They're causing trouble, but it's good trouble, if I'm to quote former Congressman John Lewis, where this was something that needed to be done. It was hard. It was a dirty job. It was a lot of work. It's caused a lot of controversy. But if you think about the impact that it had in improving working conditions and improving economic conditions, improving society as a whole, because it's drawing attention to some of these injustices. You have Chicago reporter Henry Lloyd, one of the earliest muckrakers, talked about Standard Oil in the 1880s. Atlantic Monthly was and McClure's. I pulled a lot of political cartoons from McClure's magazine, even Cosmopolitan. They all competed, and it's fairly similar to like even the yellow journalism of the imperialist time period, which we've already talked about, where they were trying to compete with each other. They're trying to come up with the most controversial story so that they could sell their books and their articles, their magazine articles. And that'll eventually kind of be the downfall of the muckrakers, is that eventually, and they made a lot of positive change, but eventually they kind of on the decline, because it's like they got all the scandalous stuff, right? They couldn't top one another anymore, and Americans kind of fell off it wasn't as entertaining to them anymore, so they didn't sell as much. So progressive ideology, when it came to political reform, was really focused on this idea of democracy or democratization, which is something that we've talked about in the past. Within cities, it's kind of building off of the idea of universal white male suffrage, and becoming more democratic, especially in how voting is done and how laws are being passed. So first, by 1910, All states were using now a secret ballot, sometimes referred to as an Australian ballot. That's where those first reformers pulled the idea from. So we haven't talked too much about this, but like in the past, like during the Gilded Age and before, I mean, voting differs in states because that is one of the delegated powers to the states. So it really did differ in each area. So that's why this is going to be a reform that's going to be taking place at the local level and at state level. But before the secret ballot, one of the reasons that political machines remain powerful, why white supremacists will kind of maintain control over African American voters, is because there was no such thing as a secret ballot. Ballots would be printed by the political party. You would ask for that ballot. People would watch you vote, and they would watch you put it in each container or box. There was no such thing as having a ballot printed out by the government, by the state, going into a secret location with a curtain or whatever it might be, to where you could vote privately and have that security. Other examples of democratization are going to be direct primaries. So Robert LaFollette, which I mentioned earlier, was a Republican from Wisconsin. In 1903, they introduced the idea of using popular vote to decide in each state primary, like who the nominee is going to be for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. You have the 17th Amendment, which is the direct election of senators in 1913. So before the 17th Amendment, senators were selected by their state legislature. So it was almost, and remember the Senate is like the upper house, right? So you serve for 6 years, you're there a little bit longer. It was really open to corruption because, how powerful are you? How can you influence that legislature? A lot of the times people are being voted, like by their friends and because of their economic power. And then when you get to the Senate, you have 6 years to kind of sit around and do nothing and not worry about your reelection or your reappointment, basically. So after 1913, the people of the state voted on 2 representatives, like to represent them in Washington, D.C. Other examples of state and local reforms or political reforms are going to be the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. So an initiative is a way in which the voters can kind of like persuade the legislature to consider a bill. Referendum is probably what we use most often today. It allows the citizens to vote on a proposal. So, and how states are doing this now is if it's like a controversial issue, like for example, recreational use of marijuana, instead of the legislature, the representatives voting on it, it's a referendum. So they wait until the next election, they put it on the ballot, and popular direct democracy, popular vote wins, whether or not the people of the state want that. So they don't give that power to the representative, it's given to the people. And then recall was also really important during this era because of the amount of corruption, where voters could vote to remove a corrupt politician or just unsatisfactory. You don't really see that as much now. Lately, there have been some examples of some politicians that have made bad decisions, and the people basically called for their resignation. Most end up resigning before they draw out this process of a recall. And again, that's in like local level. So other municipal reforms in Toledo, Ohio, Republican Mayor Sam Golden Rule Jones did a series of things that really helped his community at the local level. So free kindergarten, night school to give opportunities for people that would work during the day. They could go to night school in order to become literate, or like even provide more opportunities for them for jobs, public playgrounds and public parks, things like that. City political bosses, so those political machines, and their corrupt alliances with trolley lines and utility companies. So a lot of reformers. So these were things that were done. Like today we have Winston-Salem public transit. The city is in charge of providing public transportation so that it's equitable. Same thing with utilities, right? We pay not a private utility company. We pay the city of Winston-Salem for clean water. And what it does is, and there are elected officials within that. So when their job is connected to keeping the people happy, the water is going to be cleaner. Sanitation, that's another thing that we do. That's contracted out. But by 1915, 2/3 of all U.S. cities have their own water systems, gas lines, electric power, and those urban transportation systems. In the state of North Carolina, water is public. They hire out sanitation companies in some cases, and it just depends on the contract. Sometimes it's cheaper to hire a company to collect trash than it is to employ those people within the city, to keep taxes down. But you also know that for Duke Power it's almost like a little monopoly, right? Because Duke Power is a private company. However, during this time, because of the progressive era, and cracking down on those power companies or on those monopolies, what it does is it allows the state of North Carolina to regulate Duke Power. So if they want to raise prices, it has to be approved by the General Assembly, by our legislature. So yes, technically you only have one option when it comes to providing power, for cost. But the government is that competition, or that check on that monopoly's power when it comes to power plants. And the reason that that's the case, the reason that we don't have multiple power companies, is the infrastructure is extremely expensive. Duke Power uses hydroelectric power. You just have to have the resources and the money in order to do that. And so instead of doing that, we have the government kind of regulates them, if you've ever wondered. All right, state reforms. A lot of states are going to abolish or prohibit the sale of alcohol. And again, that plays a large role in the temperance movement, which we've talked about since before the Civil War. In addition to that, we've already talked about Jane Addams and the Hull House, trying to improve urban areas and provide immigrants opportunities and resources to kind of better themselves. Florence Kelly is going to play a really big role in really pushing for issues that help urban women. So she lobbies for better schools, more divorce, or liberalizing those divorce laws to give women more opportunities if they're in an abusive relationship. And then she also went after the safety regulations of those apartment buildings, those tenement homes and factories, and working conditions for women. She's going to play a role in the National Child Labor Committee. So 2/3 of states are going to adopt child labor laws. Eventually, the Supreme Court, the federal government is going to pass a child labor law, and the Supreme Court will unfortunately limit that. But still, it's a step in the right direction. She also founded the National Consumers League to promote laws to protect women from long working hours. An example of a lot of reform came after was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. It's a horrible situation where women were working in, so a shirtwaist was if you think about Victorian era, women, what they wore, it was ready-made shirt, white stiff shirt. It was called a shirtwaist. It was very popular. Women would purchase more than one. And so it was, they were making a lot in this particular factory in New York City. And what the owners of the factory had done is apparently there had been some women that had been stealing fabric scraps. And so one of the things that they did is they were, checking bags and all of this. But what they had done is they had locked a lot of doors to where you couldn't get out. There were no fire escapes. There are no fire sprinklers. A lot of the things that we think about today, when fire marshals come through and inspect things, it's to make sure that it's safe so that if there is an emergency, people have access to get out. There was only one way to get in and out, and that was so that they could search these women to make sure that they weren't stealing. A horrible fire took place on one of the floors, and pretty much every woman on the floors, the 4 floors above, ended up dying. 146 women, a couple men that were managers as well. But it really did sparked women's activism and making sure that women were being protected in the workplace. So being unusual to the presidency is going to be Teddy Roosevelt. He was the youngest person to ever assume the office when McKinley was assassinated. Ton of energy, loved coffee. It's always one of my favorite stories about him. Is that he would drink like a gallon of coffee a day, and so if you can imagine just someone that has like hyperactive, hyperactive, like always bouncing around from one thing to the next. But one thing that's different about him and how he shaped the presidency was this idea of what he called the bully pulpit. He believed that because he was in this position where he had the attention of Americans as president, that he was going to use that powerful position in order to convince Americans and convince legislators about policy. So from this point on, he the office of the presidency, not so much of just like running the executive departments, but he wanted to drive legislation. And so he would talk about issues that he felt like needed to be addressed. The press would pay attention. You can also imagine that sold a lot of newspapers. And Congress listened. And that's how it is today, right? When presidential candidates run for office, they have an agenda. They have policies that they want to see enacted, even though it technically, like the Constitution, delegates that power to Congress. Presidents on both sides over the last 100 years have used their position of power to encourage legislation. And it started with Teddy Roosevelt because he believed, especially with progressive reforms, that there were some things that needed to be done. And the Republican congressmen weren't going to do anything about it. So, and I expressed too, that's one of the reasons that I do admire Teddy Roosevelt as a president, is that his decision making had more to do with what was the right thing to do for the American people than whether or not it lined up with his party. And he led them. He led members of the Republican Party to be in support of progressive legislation that made sense and was good for everyone. And that's really the idea of his square deal. It started with the coal miners' strike, to where there was this dispute between labor and the coal mine factory, the owners of the factory. The strike was going on. The American people were worried about freezing to death in the coming winter because you had to have coal to heat your home. If you also think about the living conditions of a lot of people, especially in cities, how important that is to have heat in their homes. It's not like they had fireplaces on, in a rural, farmhouse or something. Like the vast majority of people in these urban areas, they had to have coal in order to heat their homes and stay safe and healthy. And so Roosevelt brought in both parties. And when the factory owners weren't going to budge, he threatened to use the United States military, because they weren't willing to compromise. So to use the military to go in and start taking coal. And so they did. They came to the table. They negotiated. The owners didn't have to recognize the union, but the workers did receive a 10% pay increase. They got their 9-hour workday, and then the people of America got coal, and it was seen as this big success. And again, it made him very popular. He was known as a trust buster, in particular, because he saw trust as two different things. There are good trusts and there are bad trusts. There are trusts that exist that maybe need some regulation, some restraint, but they're efficient, they have low prices, they're not hurting the consumers. Bad trusts are hurting the public, and they're stifling competition, and they are making it to where capitalism doesn't work for everyone, okay? And so he went after railroad companies first. The Supreme Court, because of his leadership, actually starts to uphold the Sherman Antitrust Act. They went after Standard Oil, 40 other large corporations, but they left some, like they left U.S. Steel, because the prices were okay. I really like this political cartoon that was drawn because so we know that Teddy Roosevelt was an avid hunter, right? He after his wife and his mother passed away and he kind of fell into a bad place, he went out west and he was a cowboy and traveled the west and kind of fell in love with the landscape. And so because of that, he was a conservationist, but he also enjoyed hunting, which if you know, like hunting is kind of a part of conservation with population control. So that was kind of based on this cartoon. Another thing about Teddy Roosevelt is he had gone on this hunt and he had brought the press with him, and they're in the woods. And this is how the story goes, at least, to where they're in the woods and a bear comes up, and it was a mama bear. And he like takes aim to shoot, but then he like holds back and he's like, oh, and sure enough, this little baby bear came on. He's like, oh, nope, can't do that. Like that's good. And so, but the press like loved it. So they wrote it in the paper about, he's just, what we have the phrase now, like a teddy bear that comes later. But in the press, it was very popular. Like, oh, like, look at Teddy Roosevelt leaving the mama bear alone. So anyways, a toy maker saw this story. He noticed that Teddy Roosevelt is really popular. The bear story was really popular. And he was struggling. And so he created a bear and he called it a teddy bear, and he sold millions. And even today, like every kid has a teddy bear that's after Teddy Roosevelt because he was this popular figure. So this cartoon is playing off of that bear thing and the hunting and just Teddy Roosevelt being Teddy Roosevelt. And so he has hunted and he has killed a bad trust, one that takes advantage of consumers and the people. Okay. If you can tell, there is a scared little bear that's labeled good trust. And he's scared, he's intimidated, he's watching Teddy Roosevelt, and he is on a leash that says restraint. Okay. Teddy Roosevelt's view is if we take out the bad trust, it will force the good ones that we deem that aren't behaving badly yet, it'll keep them in line. They're not going to take advantage of American consumers because they know we'll come after them, right? So they're timid. They've got their eye on them. They're going to play by the rules and not hinder competition, okay? And then in the background, you have a bear just kind of doing what is want. Those are like small businesses and companies that are kind of free to kind of do whatever they want. So there's no, they don't have to worry about the big monopolies buying them out or driving down prices. They get to move around freely. I've never been able to figure out as to why he has a bunch of little, like something in his sack. I don't know. All I can find, analysis wise, is that those are the businesses that can roam freely and operate freely because they don't have to worry about a big bad monopoly hurting their business. So I really like this cartoon. So part of his square deal and progressive reform too is going to be railroads was a big issue for him. And he pushed through the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act, which allowed for the Interstate Commerce Commission, which they've been around for a while, but they really haven't been effective. This allows them to be more effective. It gives them a little bit more authority. They're going to help those farmers. The populace would have been in favor of these things. In addition to that, we'll talk about Pure Food and Drug and Meat Inspection when we talk about Upton Sinclair. But in conservation in particular, he set aside over 100 million acres in order to prevent private companies coming in or land being sold by the federal government to companies where they were going to, strip it of its natural resources. He appointed a guy by the name of Gifford Pinchot as the first director of Forest Service, and he was very popular among progressives. And that's going to later become an issue between Roosevelt and his successor, William Howard Taft. So Roosevelt stuck with the two-term tradition. Even though he wasn't elected as president in 1900, when McKinley was assassinated just a few months in, he really saw that as his 4 years. So sticking with that Washingtonian tradition, elected easily in 1904 and decided to step out in 1908. Taft was his Secretary of War. They were friends. he convinced him to be president. Like I said before, Taft really had no desire to do that. And while foreign policy, especially, that was not his thing. Like we talked about how he kind of just was like, didn't want anything to do with it, but still promoted expansion for economic reasons, because he is like considered kind of like this conservative Republican, which is interesting. And sometimes it's difficult to understand when Teddy kind of like handpicked him, and when he won, the idea was that he was going to continue the work of Teddy Roosevelt. And he did, kind of. He actually was more of a trust buster than Teddy Roosevelt was. He went after more companies, even though he was more conservative fiscally than Teddy Roosevelt. They prosecuted twice the number of antitrust cases, and in particular, they went after U.S. Steel. That was one that Teddy Roosevelt had kind of left alone, like, we got your eye on you. And I think most of that had to do with the role that steel played in the growing economy. Taft, however, went after it. Roosevelt took it personally. It's probably one of his weaknesses. He did have a bit of a temper, and was very upset about it. And in addition to that, he also upset a lot of conservationists when he fired Gifford Pinchot. Okay. You had the Van Elkins Act, you had the 16th Amendment, which was income tax. So that was popular among progressives because the graduated income tax predominantly affected the wealthier people. So like you hear today the phrase, make the rich like pay their fair share of taxes. It was kind of that same idea, because the income disparity was so great between the rich and the poor at that point in time. And even today, like, how do you fix it? Well, you're not going to do something like, an income or a salary cap in America. Like, we don't believe in that. But what you can do is tax them heavier than the people that make less money, so that money then it can be used on like certain social programs. And that's how it's justified even today. Is that when you look at how the top 1% of earners in this country, if you look at how much more money they make than like the bottom 90%, that's what they mean by that, their fair share, even though that is controversial. And we'll talk about that. So there starts to become a split in the Republican Party, and a lot of it has to do with tariffs. So conservative Republicans want to support business in however they can. However, during this era, a lot of Republicans do realize that the monopolies, even though for a long time they're like, yeah, let them go, like, let's rake in some bucks, that had to do with some of the corruption as well. By this point, conservative Republicans are okay with regulating monopolies. But the big issue here is tariffs. So Roosevelt would have been in favor of reducing tariffs. However, Taft and the conservative Republicans wanted to raise tariffs. They wanted to limit the competition of foreign competition, which again just makes the prices of goods go up. Where Democrats or progressives wanted to lower tariffs to lower prices for people, because again, a lot of Americans are living in poverty during these years. And how they saw it is that the tariffs benefited the wealthy, rich elite, and it hurt at the expense of like the working class people. That's a continuity that goes all the way back to like what Jefferson and Hamilton were arguing about. Okay. Taft also started to support some like conservative Republicans in the midterm election. And so a lot of progressives who had kind of maybe like joined the Republican Party in support of Teddy Roosevelt, like they're moving away from Taft. They're looking towards maybe the Democratic Party, but sometimes they're a little too extreme. And so they really wanted Teddy Roosevelt to run as a third party candidate in 1912. And that's exactly what he did. In addition to the split in the Republican Party, so you're going to have the Bull Moose Party or the Progressive Party with Teddy Roosevelt. You're going to have Taft in the Republican Party. So Taft got that nomination. Woodrow Wilson's going to be nominated for the Democrats. We'll talk about him in a second. But the Socialist Party is also playing a role. So if we were to put it on a political spectrum, from left to right. And I hope that this translates in the video. But on the left, like super far left, super far liberal, is going to be the Socialist Party led by Eugene V. Debs, then the Democrats, then the Progressives, and then the Republicans. I would say that the progressives, and that's important too, is that the progressives of this era were moderate. The radicals were the socialists, where they were talking about public ownership of railroads. So no private companies handling railroads. Utilities is something that's going to eventually happen. And even like major industries like the oil and the steel industry, is that the government would control those things, which is for sure kind of what we associate as like socialists or like even communists of the 1950s. We're not quite there yet, historically, when talking about the Communist Party. Because this is all theory at this point in time. It hadn't really been put into practice yet in any nation. Eugene V. Debs, remember, he'd been around since the Pullman strike. He was arrested and jailed. And that was when he really radicalized, because he tried the moderate approach and it didn't work. It ended up him being arrested and thrown in jail. And so he's going to run for president from jail, by the way. He's going to run 5 times. I don't think he was in jail all of those times. I know that in 1912 he was in jail. And outspoken critic of business. Again, he was radicalized. He believed that he tried the moderate approach and it's not going to work, that there needed to be a radical change, and that was the Socialist Party. But what's interesting, and one of the things that we'll kind of talk about now, is that when we look at our society today, there are some of these things that we have applied. So an 8-hour workday, utility companies are owned by the cities, pensions, workers' compensation, like if you get hurt at your workplace, like that the workplace pays for your like healthcare or your care. And what that does is it makes sure that you're in a safe workplace. If they know they have to pay for your medical care, they're going to create a safe workspace. And then there are lots of other things that where tax dollars go to support a program that benefits the good. So the common good, all of society. So public education, police and fire departments, like those are tax supported. That is a part of kind of the socialist platform that we commonly accept today. Okay, so in the election, you got Taft, the incumbent. Roosevelt's coming back for the Progressive Bull Moose Party. You can use those interchangeably. The bull moose came from a saying that he made about being as strong as a bull moose. So a bull meaning male, and a moose is obviously this giant figure. One of my favorite stories about Teddy Roosevelt is when he was running for president. He was about to give a speech, and he was shot in the chest by an anarchist. And because he had written such a long-winded speech, so the speech was actually folded up in his pocket with his eyeglass case, like they were kind of back to back, and that just so happens where the bullet hit. And so it was in his chest, so it went through the eyeglass case, his speech that would have been folded over 4 times, so it was very thick. And doctors believe it was in his chest, but it didn't do any damage. He gave the hour-and-a-half speech after he was shot. And the doctors say that that thickness, that it actually slowed the bullet down, which is crazy. He gave the speech and then went to the hospital afterwards. And so that's where the phrase, I think it came from that particular incident where you can't stop a bull moose. So Roosevelt's view in this election is going to be new nationalism, more government regulation of business and unions, pushing for women's suffrage. He also wanted social welfare programs. So remember, he's going to be kind of the moderate, the middle, but he did break up. It split the Republican Party. More Republicans, though, supported Teddy Roosevelt than supported Taft. So it was really between Roosevelt, a progressive, and Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, who, if you think about like a for continuity. The Democratic Party really were about kind of like the people, and they really adopted those populist programs of the farmers and like William Jennings Bryan. And so they really wanted to help small businesses. They wanted to end corruption, limit big business. I don't Part of their platform was also limiting big government, and that was the southern part of that, because a lot of Southern Democrats, I don't know how you do all of these things, but also limit big government. That doesn't really make sense to me. There are people that believe that though today. Like there are people, when you ask them like what their political ideology is they'll say like, well, I'm a fiscal conservative, but I support like social programs, like certain things that cost money. Like, oh, I support education, or I support food stamps. I support those things, and we should have more funding for those things. But then they say they're fiscal conservatives. Like it's a little confusing. Like you can't have both. You gotta pick one, or understand how complicated all of it is. Wilson. So even though he doesn't win the popular vote, he is going to win the Electoral College by a large majority, because Taft did pull enough of those popular votes away from Teddy to where he couldn't keep up with Wilson. His ideas, even though he loses that election, his ideas of new nationalism is going to influence the New Deal during the 1930s and Johnson's Great Society of the 1960s. Teddy Roosevelt, because I think this is the last time I talk about Teddy. Can you tell I like Teddy? He will... He'll go on to travel and like he goes to Africa and travels the world after he loses this election. During World War I, his son will volunteer, and he will be a pilot in World War I. This was new technology, and it was very, very dangerous. Like the death rate of pilots in World War I was extremely high. I'm not 100% sure, but his son will be shot down in France, and dies killed in action during World War I. And after that, Teddy Roosevelt really struggles with. We saw that even like with his wife and mother. He reacted. He took it very tough, and he's going to die in the next couple of years after that. But still, he's a really cool, interesting president to teach about. I like him a lot. And so this is how the election panned out. You can see like the red or pinkish states. They're supposed to be red. Voted for Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the first Democrat in a while. So before that, it was Cleveland. Long run, they were on a conservative pendulum, and then you had Woodrow Wilson. It'll swing back to be conservative a little bit longer through the 1920s. But after 1932, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we're going to have a long streak of Democrats being elected as president. So he's also the first Southerner since Zachary Taylor. So remember, the Civil War played a role in kind of hurting the Democratic Party, I think, as well. That was one of the strategies of the Republican Party, was waving the bloody shirt and reminding people that it was those Southern Democrats that caused the war. Woodrow Wilson was an idealist. So think of World War I and think of his support for like the 14 points and the war to end all wars and self-determination of nations, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. He was an intellectual. He was a president of Princeton University, knew a lot of history. He also believed that he should guide legislation. It's important for me to make note that he was a white supremacist. The first film to ever be shown in the White House was during his administration, and it was a movie called The Birth of the Nation, and it is basically a film about the KKK and it glorified the South. He was president when a lot of the Confederate monuments and memorials, a part of that lost cause, were erected in the country, where it was kind of like as those veterans were starting to die off, and he supported it. And this is why leadership is important, is because he showed up. They put a Confederate monument in Arlington National Cemetery. And he supported it. He was there. Like, he was the speaker that unveiled this monument to honor the Confederate dead. And I know that this is a controversial thing. In the South, we have a lot of Confederate monuments. The context for which those were erected are extremely important, and knowing is that they were basically trying to rewrite history a little here. Not a little, a lot. And he played a role in that, in changing the narrative of these men deserve to be honored just like Union soldiers. And what it was kind of like, they would argue, as a part of the healing process. But with hindsight, sort of like looking back on it, like, we know that they were kind of trying to protect their honor, which we've talked about honor in the past. So he was a white supremacist. He showed, I would say, white supremacy propaganda in the White House, and that is why there's been a push to remove his name from certain buildings at Princeton University in more recent years. But when he was president, he pushed for a new freedom. So bringing back conditions of free and fair competition. There was a triple wall of privilege, he believed. Tariffs hurt the people, banks hurt the people, trusts hurt the people. And it's kind of similar to that populist view, right? The banks and the interest rates, the tariffs, the monopolies, like especially the railroad monopolies. And so it's an extension of that also affects urban people. And so that was called his New Freedom plan. He actually called a special session of Congress and requested them to lower the tariff. And that was not common. Normally they would write a letter and someone would read it. But he went down there and asked them to do it. The Underwood Tariff Act substantially lowered those tariffs for the first time in over 50 years. But that means that there's a loss in tax revenue. So that income tax that we talked about, that was increased to 6%. Today, like, I'll just tell you, like, for someone that obviously does not make a lot of money as a public school teacher, my federal income tax is somewhere in the 20s today. So if that gives you any type of perspective. In addition to that, I would say, so even though I don't really Woodrow Wilson's not one of the better presidents. He's not on my great presidents list. I do think one of the most important things that he did that made a lasting impact, a positive impact, had to do with the gold standard. The gold standard kept the rich people rich, for sure, because the people that have all the gold control all the power. And the banks weren't helping people. They were helping the monopolies and the big business people and Wall Street. And so, we used to have the Bank of the United States. Well, that had been gone for a while now because that was a controversial thing. So Wilson proposed a national banking system, and this is the banking system we have today. It's called the Federal Reserve. There are 12 district banks. It's supervised by the federal government, and it oversees the amount of money and inflation and interest rates and all of that. It oversees it. The federal government makes sure that you don't have, to a certain extent, it limits the bubbles and the bursts of the bubbles and speculation and all of those things. Those things still exist. But the government is now regulating it more closely to where, because of bankers and because of railroad financiers and all of this, they're greedy and they're looking to get rich quick. But when they do those practices and then the economy collapses because of it, it ends up affecting the people. And that was the argument that the populists made and the Democratic Party made. And so they tried to fix it with the Federal Reserve. And that's what we still have today. And it was very important. In addition to that, they're going to strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act with the Clayton Antitrust Act. So if you need to know that Clayton was stronger than Sherman, they're going to create the Federal Trade Commission, where they're going to look at unfair trade practices. The FTC is still around today. And then this is where you see they're going to help some farmers. They're going to attempt to do away with child labor, but it will be deemed unconstitutional in the Hammer decision in 1918. So segregation is still obviously an issue. It's going to be an issue all the way through the early 1970s. And we know that in the South, white supremacists, the Democratic Party, um, use their power to suppress and to keep them segregated. So we talked about Ida B. Wells and lynching. Bishop Henry Turner is going to form the International Migration Society to help them immigrate to Africa. That's something that we've talked about that abolitionists did in the 1920s. We'll also talk about Marcus Garvey and how he will kind of also have that movement. Some did make their way out as exodusters to Kansas and Oklahoma or out west. But remember, it's very difficult we talked about this in class, financially, especially because of the sharecropping system and tenant farming. Cyclical poverty and debt was just something that was inescapable, and then they didn't have the opportunity to move. Eventually, the Great Migration will occur in World War I. It'll allow African Americans to escape the discrimination. Well, to a certain extent. The North still discriminated against African Americans for sure. One of the civil rights leaders of this period was Booker T. Washington. He was a former slave. He had the opportunity to become educated at Hampton Institute, and he founded the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama in 1881. Now, his goal was to improve the lives of African Americans. That was his goal. He lived in the South. He had lived discrimination. He had lived through slavery. He was young. And so he is trying to help African Americans be successful economically within society and just live a life as normal as possible in this system that discriminated against them. And he was pragmatic in that he believed that economically, if African American communities could succeed economically, then they could have some normalcy. And then the political and the social justice will occur. That they would be respected by white counterparts as successful business people or successful farmers or tradesmen. And so he believed that education, which that's something that had helped him move up to like middle class Black America, that he wanted to do the same for others. And so he created an industrial and agricultural schools where African Americans, they weren't limited to sharecropping and tenant farming and endless poverty and debt, but instead they could earn actual money based on like the skills that they learned, because they didn't have any skills except for farming. Okay. And he did talk about hard work. And of course, the white people of this time period really liked Booker T. Washington because they're like, look what Booker T says. Like, if you just work hard and, you become economically self-sufficient, you get off the farm and you open your business and you sell to Black Americans in your community, like you'll be successful, like good job. There was the comment about like bootstraps, like you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, meaning like, just some hard work and you'll be fine. That's not really what he meant. It's taken out of context. He did believe in hard work. But also remember, like a lot of African Americans didn't even have any boots to pull themselves up from. So you had to be given the opportunity. And he did wonderful work in giving African Americans opportunities. They also organized the Negro Business League in order to encourage African Americans to, buy from one another and trade with one another and help each other economically with Black businesses. And even today, one of the things that I think that was positive after the incident with George Floyd and the summer of a lot of racial tension is that a lot of white Americans wanted to help and support Black communities economically, especially during the COVID pandemic, is that we know that communities of color have been disproportionately affected because of like health-wise because of the pandemic, but especially economically. It's affected a lot of their businesses. And so one of the things that a lot of white Americans have tried to do is some white Americans have done is to try and support them, support their businesses. And that was kind of the idea at this point in time, except it's Black Americans supporting Black businesses. A lot of whites saw this as a threat. And in particular, like there was the Wilmington massacre, where a democratically elected Republican legislature in Wilmington, North Carolina, in a middle class black, like the black community in Wilmington, North Carolina, from the in the as because of Reconstruction, so from the 1870s, 80s, and into the 1890s, they were very successful. They had they were almost like a perfect example of black middle class. They were self-sufficient. They had elected representatives. There were white Republicans that worked with them, but there were also a lot of white supremacists that didn't like it. And in the 1890s, they a coup. They led a coup to overthrow that government in Wilmington, North Carolina, and killed a lot of African Americans as a form of intimidation, and it was never the same. And so that was seen as a threat. So even Booker T. Washington, to a lot of white supremacists, he was seen as a threat. More radical or more idealistic is going to be W.E.B. Du Bois. Again, his goal is the same. He wants for African Americans to be treated equally in this country, but he criticized Booker T. He said, no, like, I'm not going to accept discrimination. We need to demand equality. His background is very different. Born in the North, never experienced the discrimination that Southern blacks experience. He was discriminated against. He's college educated. He was a writer, an author. Whites read his books and supported him. And he demanded that politically, voting rights need to be returned and segregation needs to end, and grant immediate civil rights to all Americans. So it was, to us, that just seems like basic and common sense, but at that point in time, it was more radical. That economic independence could not occur until there was political and social equality, where Booker T argued, yes, we can have economic independence, and then that will lead to political and social equality. So two men, same goal, but two different approaches. That's a good comparison, historical comparison. You could argue that one or the other is not the way to handle it, but instead maybe a combination of both. And our last group is going to be the women, and they played a really important role in reforms from the very beginning, from the abolitionist movement and in education and in healthcare. Women played a role before the Civil War, and they realized then, remember, that like they were being turned away from some of these conferences, so they're doing all the legwork, and that really incited women, like as early as Seneca Falls, to like, we need to have more control over our lives politically. And early on, they were talking about like divorce, being able to divorce their abusive husbands, and they were talking about being able to inherit land when their husband dies instead of it going to their sons. It was things like that. And then after the war, it was suffrage, and they're going to fight for suffrage for the next few decades. Carrie Chapman Catt to be president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, where their number one goal is suffrage. So where it was radical before, now this is something that more and more women and men are like, yeah, that makes sense. Like Teddy Roosevelt, for example, supported women's suffrage. Woodrow Wilson did not. And they're going to work to earn votes in states. So again, each state some states would allow for women to vote, but on a federal level, it was not guaranteed. Alice Paul, she was a militant suffragette, so she took it to the next level. They did protests to get arrested, and then when they would get arrested, and this was all a part of their plan because it drew news coverage to their cause. So here you have examples of women being physically detained and arrested, these women that are supposed to be, treated well in society. And these are upper middle class women that are educated and that are well respected. So her goal was like, no, we need to make this more dramatic. We need to make a scene, which is not something that it was acceptable for them to do. And even when she was like in jail for some of these protests, I mean, nothing turned like violent, like they were just asked to leave. So they were assembled and they would have marches, and it would kind of escalate. They would be arrested, and then she would go on hunger strikes. So, and there would be journalists that followed it and that wrote about it, and it drew a lot of attention to Woodrow Wilson, and he was really criticized because he like dug his heels in and he was not going to support that cause. And even as the progressive era ends in 1917 because of World War One, it's not until after the war is over where women finally, we just celebrated the 100th anniversary this past year, where women were guaranteed the right to vote by the federal government, by the Constitution of the United States. And it was because of World War One. I mean, these women obviously played a really important role, but because of the role that women played in mobilization and what they did as men went off to fight, and the role they played in the factories and on the farms and organizing and rationing and all of these things, you could not deny that women should play a role in politically and have a voice politically. And again, that was a result of World War One.